In the order that they're on the agenda: public-private leases, equitable development rubric, a tool for the CRA negotiation committee, and then committee goals in review. So I want to start by sharing a couple thoughts around the first topic. So there are several underutilized or vacant places in the city that would be ideal for any type of pop-up or permanent experiences to enhance our quality of life. Public-private leases are one tool to get towards using spaces, whether it be short or long-term investments. To date, as a committee, we've discussed some parameters with the law department in our last meeting, giving some feedback that are typical for the types of agreements municipalities consider and then agree upon with interested private parties. We have not, as a committee, asked the city to take any action. We've not reported this out to council, but in the last 6 months, there's been 2 different private organizations who have expressed interest in having some type of agreement with the city, and they're at varying stages of that. So I've printed out and made sure this committee received a copy of Ordinance 10 from 2015. This is an example where the city declared a property to be surplus and then entered into a lease agreement. In this specific case, it's the Norwood Firefighters Association. Many people are familiar with the new museum space and how it's been utilized, even for community gatherings. I was not aware of how that lease came about when we first were approached back in August with the topic of public-private leases. And so I wanted to make sure we had that resource in hand since we needed to revisit this topic tonight. I also wanted to really urge us to think about how we might re-engage this conversation, or rather how you might re-engage this conversation in 2020. Given the timeline that we've had meetings and the timing of the year, we're not going to meet again. But there are multi-million-dollar opportunities that will be coming, if not to Norwood, adjacent to Norwood. And this is a tool which I think would be really helpful if the committee, if council, if the administration would really put some muscle behind to figure out how to make it work. So you've got that copy in front of you. We've had a little bit of discussion. I shared in our last meeting I would follow up. I did get a chance to talk with Off-Pike, and I did get a response from the law department. Both parties were in very different places. You might recall that the interest of Off Pike was more along the lines of having some type of letter of interest, just basically saying, does the city want to work in this way? Nothing prescriptive, because that's just not where that organization's at. There have been other conversations, not in a public meeting, where there's been an ask of the city to consider parameters, and at the time that I had a chance to talk to the administration, there wasn't momentum to move that forward, given the timing of the year and the new administration that's getting ready to begin. So I'd like to suggest that when we report out what we found to be potential framework in the parameters that we discussed, but also urge the next council to keep working towards some type of position. So love to hear your thoughts at this time on where we go with this topic. Yeah.
I'm fine with reporting out what we've done so far. I think for the next council, if it's going to stay with if it stays with the Economic Development Committee, things I think to work out are the level of investment the city is willing to make in the organization or businesses that may be wanting to use properties. To me, that's probably the biggest question when somebody or some group comes in and wants to, for instance, the market space. Depending on the terms of the lease, for instance, the lease that the fire department got, I can't remember, but I think it's a very low dollar lease. So it's the, do you know?
It's $1 per year.
It's $1 per year. So, for instance, if you're going to work on a lease like that with an organization for one of our buildings, that's a significant investment that our community and our city is actually making in that organization. So when I start to think about the dollars that are involved in that kind of a thing, that's when I want to see much more robust business plans, financial data. You know, if I was an investor and somebody was going to come to me wanting a certain amount of money for their business, I would expect them to be able to present to me a very well organized, long, list and plan of how they expect this business to run, how they expect profits to work, all that kind of stuff. I think that we need to consider that kind of thing. And it's really on an individual basis that comes in. So it's hard, I think, I really like the worksheet that you had last, well, it wasn't the worksheet, but it was the kind of the things that could be an agreement. And I think that's probably the right way to go, that could be in an agreement, because I think everything needs to be evaluated on an individual case-by-case basis, because because exactly the level of investment that the city might be entering into with the party.
Okay. Thank you. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. So, yeah, looking at this lease for the firehouse, right at Ivanhoe, it's kind of shocking. The term is 25 years, and the sole discretion of the tenant, they can have a additional 25-year renewal. So I mean, that firehouse is basically locked up now for 50 years. And that was passed in 2015 by that council, and I was actually at that meeting, and I remember speaking to Sarah Allen about it, and she asked a few questions about it, but there was that council passed it at that point. You might have been on that council, Mr. Braden, at that point. I'm pretty sure you were. So anyways, I don't understand why that would have happened. I mean, it's a $1 a year for 50 years, and the city has no opportunity to take it back if they wanted it. So anyways, it's I would just want to make sure that there are, in any future lease, my big thing is performance guarantees. So we need to make sure that if somebody is wanting to use a city building for something, for a long term, to have control kind of the use of the building, then there needs to be performance guarantees about what they're going to do, and so we can make sure that they're actually following up with it. And then also just what essentially, when they're going to do it. And I do agree with Mr. Thompson when he was talking about the budgets and funding to make sure that that's there. I think the Norwood professional firefighters, I think they were able to get the donations that they needed to actually rehab it, which is a good thing. So it looks like they did, follow through on some of that.
And that's why it needs to be a case-by-case basis.
Yes. But what if they wouldn't have gotten the funding that they needed to rehab it, and it just would have been dilapidated in disrepair for the next 25 or 50 years? Now, they're a reputable organization, so they would have, I'm sure, if they couldn't handle it, then they would have given it back to the city at some point. But that's, who's to say that's always going to happen? So another concern, well, I won't go nitpick this lease completely, but there are some things that I would have probably asked more questions on.
So I just want to interject at this point. I provided that as an example so that we and the public know the city has not for the first time done this when this was referred to this committee. And I think the questions that are being raised are going to be a great segue to our second topic when we get to it. But I want to make it clear that we have an opportunity as a committee to report out and say these are things we think are valuable to ask, valuable for the future administration, committee members, council to keep in mind. So I'm taking note of the questions you're highlighting. I'll make sure I add those if they're not already on the MOU elements document we talked about as an addendum for our report so that all council members can see that too.
Right, there was a lot of those questions already within
I think there were a lot on there, about 15, 18 of them we went through. So I'll make sure I call out the ones we're discussing as well.
Yeah, and I would just say too, so like if somebody wants to come to us in the future I know the current off-pipe market, they were looking more for, like you said, letter of interest, just some letter from the city saying, hey, look, they're not just making this up, like we're interested in potentially seeing a market here. But if there is somebody that's coming, like wanting to use the building for like some long-term purpose, I would hope that they would have a lot of the stuff more drafted out ahead of time, because that committee meeting where we went and talked about each of those items, well, many of those items did not need to be addressed in a committee. They could have been worked out, typed up, and then given to the committee to discuss later. So
I would agree with that, except for the fact that the city has never provided a tool for anyone to approach them to prepare. That's been something that's happened multiple times in the last 2 years. So I'm in agreement. There was a lot of that could have been worked out ahead of time, and thankfully, in that particular case, HCDC provided that outline. That was not anything provided by the city.
Gotcha. Well, that's helpful to know. But I will just say too, I think it would be helpful for anybody that wants to pursue this. I mean, again, work with the city administration, work with the law department, but I don't want to see, this committee, whatever it might look like in the future, spending hours and hours and hours trying to negotiate a lease in public where, some of these things can be worked out and then discussed. Again, we'll discuss it in public, what have you, but I'm not a professional on all of these different terms. I mean, there's 8 or 9, 10, 12 different parts of this the firehouse lease. So I just wouldn't want to see that happen, I guess, again. So
I think that's a great call out so that the council and administration can consider what kind of support do they want to provide in order to help investors present a full, comprehensive proposal. So I'm taking note of that as
great.
well.
Thank you.
Anything else on this topic?
The only thing that comes to mind is I'm not going to pick apart this lease that was done 5 years ago, but basically it's on as the agenda as a public-private leases. So we're basically saying that this is a private, that the fire department is a private entity. They're a city department.
That's
so
not
basically
correct. The agreement, if you look at the first chunk of it, it's actually with the Norwood Firefighters Association, which is a nonprofit organization.
Okay.
So that the city is in an agreement with that nonprofit.
Okay. Is that
So it is separate from the Norwood Fire Department.
okay?
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay. So again, I think that was a good discussion to set us up for the second topic. So I want to start with the score sheet document. So in our last meeting, we talked about what it could be like to have a negotiation committee, to Mr. Bonsal's point, a committee that is not holding public meetings, but represents multiple stakeholder views to help think through what's the value of any type of development agreement being proposed to the city. We'll get to that draft language in a moment, but one of the things that came out of discussion, particularly with the law department, was how would a group of people, whether they be city officials or interested citizens, go about setting some type of criteria? What you have in your hand is a tool. It was developed here locally, and it's being introduced and adopted in many Cincinnati neighborhoods to ensure development meets the needs of residents and businesses. If you saw the news today, you probably saw some of the, well, you may have, I don't know, there's a lot of news out there. You may have seen that there's a church in the West End that isn't going to be preserved. And that was part of an ongoing conversation about what residents value at the same time that development is taking place down there. And so the goal of introducing a tool like this, and this is one piece of it, we've talked about the equitable development rubric before, is to be able to have a tool that helps anyone involved in the process really strategically consider what's the value add. This is, again, one piece of it, but it would allow us to begin to think through, for what dollar investment is it worth having a 15-year agreement? We don't really have any criteria like that outlined to date. It would help think through, okay, well, if you're going to ask for this type of financing, is there something else the city should ask for in return? And again, length of time. So this isn't a tool that says you have to decide a certain way, but this is a tool that could support a negotiation committee in thinking through what's valuable for the city overall. I've asked the staff from the Peasley Center who developed this to join us in our committee report on Tuesday. I'm not sure if that staff will be able to or not, but I wanted to give some time where that can be hopefully discussed and shared so there's a better understanding. We're not just asking a group of residents who want to comment on development to get together. We're thinking through, based on state best practice, how to equip local stakeholders to think about what's in the best interest of our our community. So that's a piece of the tool. I know I mentioned it last time, so I wanted to get a piece in front of you while we look at that draft legislation. So if you would I'm opening, but if you reference the draft operative language, I believe this was sent out a week or two ago. And so I'm interested in any feedback. We discussed adding these pieces in. We discussed having certain membership and then designees. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then I'll provide a couple updates on conversations I've had with some of the suggested or potential members. Mr. Bonsall?
Yeah, so I actually had just a couple questions. Now that we, know who the next mayor will be, has there been any conversation with the future administration to find out what they're thinking when it comes to the CRA negotiating committee?
Thanks for asking that. So that's something I plan to share. That has not been feasible to have that conversation yet. Prior to this meeting, rather. Let me say it that way.
Gotcha. And do you expect this? We haven't seen the council agenda yet. So do you expect this to be on the agenda for the next council meeting?
I think that is something important for us to talk about once we get a point of view on what it is.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't want to shortchange any discussion about it, but I do have a thought on where this might go. So in terms of the content, we discussed the language from the enforcement program being put into this version. So that's been added. I'd be curious if you see anything there that isn't looking right. as well as any comments on the potential membership.
Well, excuse me, if it's okay. So it says one member will be appointed by Norwood City Schools. Are we expecting that the school board would appoint them, or would the superintendent appoint that person?
It would be up to that body. In my conversation with the district, I believe best practice suggests, and I think the school board would ultimately decide, but I think thus far, most development conversations or questions go through the school treasurer.
So, okay, gotcha. So that would be one where I would recommend potentially, like, if one member is going to be appointed by Norwood City Schools. Okay, so there's also a second section here, let me rephrase, where it says that you can have members that will be specific, like, people underneath the list. So
yeah, there's a list of member entities, and then that member would have a designee.
okay, so the way that I read this is that there's two different types of ways that people can be appointed to this. One is can be there's appointing authorities, so HCDC, Norwood Chamber of Commerce, Rice, and then there's also members, it looks like, on this next section that are like named, called out. So like I would expect like the mayor, safety service director, right, or whoever that you would call those people on, like specifically on here, that they're always a part of the negotiating committee. So to me, I wouldn't mind seeing one member will be the school treasurer or their designee, and then you could still even have one member appointed by the Norwood City School District Board of Education.
So I think your understanding of it is a little different than I think how it reads in the actual program. What you're saying, I think, is the outcome we've discussed as a committee. I think the only different way of maybe saying it is you have to be a member of the committee before you can designate someone. And so this committee, I think, is trying to understand, do we have the right list of members? And then would we leave it to those members to designate somebody? Is that sounding like what you're saying, or are you understanding that differently?
I would say I'm understanding it differently. But were you going to say something, Eric?
No, you both got me pretty confused.
Okay.
What we're discussing? Yes. Absolutely. So, thank you. There, question from the audience, and appreciate you speaking up. We are discussing a negotiation committee, which is a possibility to have added into the community reinvestment area agreement process here in the city. We currently have an ordinance in place that allows for commercial and residential development to take place, and agreements historically are made and presented to this committee and or to council. And one of the things this committee acknowledged is we as a body don't represent all the stakeholders that have a role in either informing or benefiting from agreements. So we are discussing whether or not to create a negotiation committee and amend the actual ordinance. So that would be a process step, who's on that committee in terms of members and who those people are from those entities is what we're clarifying. Thanks for asking. So I think it might be helpful to figure out if we're all in agreement. We definitely want specific people to be named.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah.
How were the committee organization members chosen?
So that's a result of some of our discussions over, I don't know how many months we've been talking about this, and trying to cull together who are stakeholders in development. The guide itself talks about the treasurer from the school, economic development at the municipal level, maybe the auditor, interested citizens, other groups, council, anyone responsible for zoning, So that's kind of how that list came to mind. So that's part of why we're checking in now to see, does that reflect a good cross sector? I will say, just as a point of clarity, the school always has a role in how the CRAs are set up. And so whether the committee is established or not, they are a player in how those get approved.
Right. I mean, part of here we have city parts of city, we've got community groups. This is an example. I don't know, as valuable as ASAP Norwood is, I don't know why we care for their opinion in a CRA negotiation.
So I have an update on that.
Or I could point out others. You know, I mean, I'm not entirely comfortable with the list as it stands.
Okay. I will share, I mentioned already, I did have a conversation with the school, very interested in the concept, and I do believe, based on the recommendation from the state, it could potentially be the treasurer that the school board would consider. They don't meet until next week in committee and won't meet until later in the month overall. I had a chance to meet with ASAP earlier this week. Earlier this week. They are a coalition, so they reflect multiple departments and stakeholders throughout the community. And in addition to their makeup, they actually are the recipient of a community-wide grant. They've been active in some of the policy changes that affect, they've been active advocates, let me say that, in some of the policy changes that affect retail business. So you may recall hearing about the change with the tobacco policies, how old you have to be to buy tobacco. That's now a state law that's been changed. And thinking through local enforcement, what that means for businesses, is something that they're interested in. They do a lot of prevention work with our youth in the community. And so from the perspective of having understanding of what is helpful in driving a healthy culture in our community, I think they have a point of view that others on the list would not have. And they're also already actively working at a community level. And so I think, again, the highest goal of the committee is to think about how do you get the best outcome for the entire community. And right now, it's been the elected body of council and the school who make the choice with the administration. So really trying to become more broad is the goal.
No, I get that. Just as we've, at least in my way that I've understood this, the point was to put together not only a group that was reflective of our community, but a group that had specific sort of qualified knowledge for this kind of things. And as I said, as valuable as I think ASAP is, and I've worked with them and they're great, I don't know that substance abuse prevention as an organization is the kind of expertise you want in a community reinvestment area negotiation group. I'm trying to be very defensive because they're a great organization.
Sure. I hear what you're saying. You're thinking that it may not be the best place for their influence.
Right. It's not that I wouldn't want to hear their input on anything that's going on. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that they would have valuable input. But this, Chamber of Commerce, yes, that makes sense to me. The Norwood Building Department, that makes sense to me. The schools, of course, they're part of it anyway. And I think it's valuable to have this group. That's why I want to make sure this group is made up of the right people.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
I agree. I don't know about, as valuable as ASAP Norwood is, I don't know about its role in this type of agreement. On another note, on section 1A, what is, for people that might not know, Norwood Together? Who are we talking about there?
Yeah, so that is a newly forming economic development corporation.
How new?
I think it'll be incorporated in the next quarter.
Okay. That's, so,
So it's a former quality of life
okay.
group. They're coming together to be more of a specific nonprofit, as you said, development organization.
It is a newly formed economic and community development organization.
Right.
And that's, you think they have a better grasp on it? Like, do you have an issue with them versus ASAP Norwood, or are we on the
No,
same
I
agreement with
also,
them?
as a brand new organization, I have an issue with them as well.
I think that that's also a question that I have. Why would they be involved in this? And they could be a great organization, and maybe they are. But why would they? I know we have a system in place now, and I stated this last meeting that, are we making this too difficult? I just, it's a question that I have. Are we making this too difficult? And I understand oversight and the ability to, oversee this type of contract with, an agreement with an organization. So, there is such a thing as maybe getting involved a little too much. I don't know. Maybe we're not. It's just something that I think about.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate all your hard work, and I noticed that you're really, you're doing a great job here. So I hesitate saying something like that.
I think
you're
this
doing
is
good work,
the right
so.
discussion. I think you all need to know what each other think, and I think the public needs to know what we think.
Yeah.
So this is that.
Okay.
Does anybody have any recommendations on any additions? Mr. Bond.
Yeah, thank you so much. I definitely think that we're missing. I think we should just read off the list here. Would you like to? I think somebody should read the list off just so people at home know.
That would be totally fine. What has been drafted is one member will be appointed by Norwood City Council, one by the Norwood Building Department, one by Norwood Together, one by Norwood City Schools, one by ASAP Norwood, one by Norwood Chamber of Commerce, and one by HCDC. This list was drafted based on the recommendations that were in the state guide. Not all of these entities have even been approached, given the timeline that we're working with. And so for the conversations I have had, I think it's definitely different. So it's good to hear all the discussion. I'm eager to hear who else you think is missing.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we're definitely missing, I think the Norwood City Administration, we should probably figure out how we add them to it.
Can you be more clear when you say that there's a lot in the administration? What do you mean?
So, right now there's, of the 7 members, there's really no representation from the city administration, and they're the ones that are actually going to be signing.
You mean specifically from the mayor?
The mayor and his direct reports, like the safety service director, or whatever that might look like in the future. I wasn't being so specific because I don't know what it's going to look like.
Right, you're right. But that, I could see where the building department sort of falls under that.
And then that's another issue. So if we talk about the Norwood Building Department, are they just going to get the office together and just say, hey, which one of us who are we going to pick to do it? Or are we actually saying the building commissioner appoints somebody? Who's the appointing authority when it comes to the Norwood Building Department? I don't think it's specific enough on that.
I would assume the administration would be.
Doesn't the mayor do that? Maybe should be
the
administration.
Responsibilities and.
Yeah. But this is where I think that we need to have 2 parts of this. One, we need to have appointing authorities, and another one that there needs to be specific people that are appointed or their designee. And I think there's some misunderstanding in how it was drafted up on the state-wise, because the CRA housing officer should probably always be on, or the CRA officer, who I forgot exactly what the terminology is for it, but the chief economic development officer, whatever it is, they should probably always be on this thing, right? If they're in charge of economic development in the city. But how are they going to get appointed if there's only these
7.
Yeah.
So to be clear, currently the housing officer and the building commissioner are the same person. That is Jerry Stoker, who leads the building department. And so an effort to create something we could discuss from, I realize we probably, and we do, have different points of view. I think it would be helpful, and I'm tracking your comments as we discuss, to maybe come up with a statement around that. So I think we all think there are certain entities that should be involved, and there are certain people that should be involved. So maybe when we go to report out, we can just be saying that.
Yeah, and I guess to me, so just thinking of like being appointed, right? So to me, if somebody is appointed like by Norwood City Council, they are appointed to be on the CRA negotiating committee. In my opinion, they shouldn't get to send their designee. It's either they show up or they don't show up, but they don't get to then decide who is going in their place, in my opinion. To me, that seems kind of odd. However, I am okay with if we have like the CRA housing officer, like he's a specific person, or the school treasurer. Let's say if they couldn't make the meeting, but there is a named person in the ordinance. I'm okay with them being able to send their designee because they are a named important component to this. And the same thing, I think that maybe you could put the mayor or their designee, but there should be named people here, like the school treasurer, the building or the economic development chief, or what have you. I think that should be always on here, and probably the mayor too should always be on here. Like, it shouldn't depend on getting appointed by some authority, because, like I said, the mayor and the safety service director, they're going to be the ones signing the agreement. Go ahead.
So what you're thinking is almost like there's a designated number, say, I don't know, however many, 4 people that are always definitely a part of it.
Yes,
And then there can be designated people in addition to them, so it's
Well-
almost like a...
well. Just if they can't make the meeting, I mean, it really should be them. But I mean, or their
in
designee.
addition to, like let's say, okay, the school treasurer is already on. That's someone
Yeah.
that we want on all the time.
Yep.
So we shouldn't have to rely on the school to designate them. But do we want to then allow the school or the school board to have another designee?
I think it's potentially, but then that would be the school board would be appointing
Right, that's
in my
what I
vision,
mean.
they would be appointing the person, and that would be the person that either comes or doesn't come. If they decide not to come, then the school board can appoint somebody else, but they shouldn't get to choose, in my opinion. Oh, I'm just going to say this other person can be the one. And in general, I do, like I said, like I do though, going back to the comments about Norwood Together and ASAP Norwood, I mean, I do think it's important to have community, like I don't know if those specific groups are the right ones, they might be, they might not, but it is important, I think, to have some kind of more community-minded representation that could potentially look at benefits that they could suggest benefits that maybe the company could provide in exchange for some of the like the tax agreements that might not be like financial benefits. They could be some other way that the community can benefit, and they might have more of a vision to know like what's going on. Potentially, it could be somebody wants to build over at Harris Avenue where the Zumbiel Box property is, right? I've suggested this, but potentially I didn't suggest this and somebody else had to bring it up, but they're going to be a parking lot around that building at some point. Well, you've already got issues with parking at the high school, I guess the stadium, right? So somebody could say, well, look, during off hours, can that be used as a parking lot for the stadium, right? So it's just something that people can bring up to look for other benefits. So like I said, I think that it doesn't just have to be the financial backers in the city. I think there could be other voices on it.
I would agree with that.
And honestly, Norwood Together, I think that once they do get their, truly become a community development corporation, nonprofit that works to catalyze, I guess, things that are going on in the future, I do think, though, that they would be a valuable consideration if, that they wanted to do, or if the city wanted to do that. There's a lot of people that are doing a lot of good stuff on there, and it's not just, although they do the cleanups, they do other things, but they've actually got quite a bit of expertise when it comes to housing and other places, and I just wouldn't want to dismiss them just because of there's some pre-existing biases in the community by certain people that are concerning to me, and I think sometimes that those biases that people want to bring up sometimes can leak into the conversation. So I don't know if they're right for right now, but I just want to make sure that I say that, again, community organizations, I think we should consider some of them and not, and Norwood together, it could be somebody else, but I think it might be a good idea.
Can I chime in here?
Yep.
Mr. Brady.
So you said a lot. I'm struggling to hear to hear what you said. Again, I'm worried we're overcomplicating this. What about, so we've discussed everyone else's input here. There's another one. One member will be appointed by HCDC. So what is your take on their involvement in this process? And are we in agreement with that, or what's your take on that?
Yeah,
I'd like to know.
to me, that's another one that, like, who at HCDC is going to actually appoint them? Or is it going to be, does HCDC have a board of directors that would be the appointing authority? Is it the executive director of HCDC? So if that is one, I do think, yes, I agree with Mr. Braden. We should be specific if we do want to keep
Mr.
it.
Bonsall, do you think it should be the board of these organizations that is the appointing authority?
Potentially, yeah. Like the Chamber of Commerce, it probably, I think it should be the,
I'd like to know why HDC, I'd like to know why you think HCDC has an input here. Just, I'm curious on why we think that they're,
I was going to say, I can answer that question, but Ms. Stevenson's, potentially you'd be better to answer that.
HCDC oversees development for the entire county. They're based here in Norwood and have an interest in supporting development in Norwood. They do everything from coaching of businesses, recruiting businesses. They have funding mechanisms. So I think it would be a very meaningful relationship with an asset that's already here.
I appreciate that. So I guess my question is, are they involved in the process now? And would they even be willing to be involved in this process? Or are we just assuming that they would be?
So at this point, they've not been specifically approached, much like there haven't been conversations with the administration, given the timeline of our conversation. And so I think this is probably a good time to say, I don't think that there's enough agreement or understanding around how this could work. I think that there was a well-intended initial conversation around making sure that we as a committee aren't hamstringed without having enough insight and understanding into development opportunities. And so I would like to propose that I summarize our discussion in our report out and urge future councils and administration to think about sustainable ways to include a broader stakeholder group and leverage existing resources so that developmental agreements really are for the good of the whole city.
Last thing, I appreciate your effort into this. Yeah. So
Thank you.
I don't mean to I don't want to, I hesitate, saying much, but I appreciate it. So I just want to make sure you understand that.
Thank you, Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I did want to make note, so, there's only 3 returning members of council, and the 3 are here. And I'm only saying that because I want to see this continue. I want to see the discussion continue, and I do think that this is very valid that we are discussing this. I do agree, though, with the chair that we should probably refer this to the next council, because I think we really need to get the city administration's, the new city administration's input on this, since they're going to be the ones that are going to have to work around this framework if it were to be passed. Like, if we would have done it back a year ago, I think it would have been fine, but at this point now, I do, like I said, think that we should really ensure that they are on board and involved and what have you, and decide. So yeah, I appreciate you summarizing it, and I do think that it, hopefully we can continue the discussion. I don't know what the committees will look like next year, but
I actually think it's pretty close. It's just fine details now that we're working on, honestly.
yeah, I mean,
As far as I'm concerned, I still think it's a good representation of what we've been talking about wanting to do with this. It's just now hammering out the the nitty-gritty bits.
Thank you all for your comments. I'm glad you three are returning and have a chance to continue to talk about this. I look forward to hearing the rest of your discussion. We're going to move on to the last part of our agenda. As soon as I write this statement, so I don't forget it.
While you're writing that, I'll just kind of state that I just said that so that it wasn't like there's there's been states and other areas where like you'll see a change of power, if you will, and you'll see like during the lame duck period that you'll see all initiatives get passed that will then hamstring a future, city. And so I only just pointed that out just to say, look guys, like there's carryover on this committee. It's not like we're trying to change something at the last second. And this is all things that we've been discussing, like Mr. Thompson said, for the last year. So I do apologize to the chair if there was any offense to that statement.
No offense stated. I literally and very specifically wrote, I urge these returning members of council to keep working on this because I think it's going to take shared understanding around the potential of not only this committee, but all the stakeholders. I'm glad for the clarity around your comments, Mr. Bonsall, around the administration. The administration has always had a role in development. In fact, for a long time, they were the only ones who seemed to have a role. And so they're explicitly not called out as the mayor, the safety service director, because there's another entity called the Planning Commission that they serve on historically and through statutory codes. So this is really an effort to say, we've had a good conversation, and as we'll get to in just a moment, we set out to try and create resources for small business development and other things to happen in our city, and I think this has been worthwhile. So I did not take offense. Just to be clear, I'm really glad you have some more work to do. So the last thing is going to be our goals. So this is our final committee meeting of the year, and I thought it would be worthwhile to look back on what we set out to do. No, we did not get it all done, but I do want to express my gratitude for being able to work with you all. We did a lot of learning. I don't know if you recall, but a year ago we spent some time talking about TIFs and bonds and how to restructure those. Do we restructure those? We talked about what's our part versus what's not our part in terms of that, and recognizing, there are some ways that council can affect policy, but there's a number of things that I think, at least in my point of view, we as a committee began to recognize we can't litigate some of the things that we'd like to see better when it comes to development, when it comes to development. We as a committee drafted a letter earlier in the year asking for support to welcome neighbors and businesses, and we got a measure of response, but thankfully that didn't require policy change. Residents have been able to move that forward, and so lots of new homeowners have had an official welcome to the city. Again, one thing that did not get complete was a welcome letter from the administration. That's something that you all can continue to run with. I'm sure residents will continue to run with as well. We talked about supporting small business. We had in our last meeting a presentation from HCDC about their small business program and all the success of it. And two of those parties who worked with them were here, one giving a testimonial, which was Norwood Together. I think that's incredible to think about it. We witnessed and helped hold space for entities to learn about that. There's a newly forming economic development corporation in our city. That's pretty awesome, I think. And so I really want to, again, thank HCDC, thank the administration for allowing that project to unfold. But I also want to just underscore that this isn't the only vehicle for small business development in Norwood, this being council, this committee. There are others. And so the more this committee can and has tried to bring resources here to use our public meeting as a platform to inform residents and stakeholders, I think that's helped reduce barriers for entry. One of the things we started off thinking about was how to engage residents. We talked about it from the phrasing neighborhood associations. Through this committee, you've heard a lot from those involved with the quality of life, and I think you've all have known, maybe have attended what's become community council meetings. That's been pretty powerful to see residents gathered and learn about what happens here. I know in Ward 1 in particular, I've had the opportunity to talk to residents and say, here's what council approved or didn't approve in our last meeting. And it's created a lot of awareness. And so I know that a lot of people were probably like, why is there community engagement at council? It's made a huge difference. I've not attended all committee meetings, but I can say I've been really thankful and glad that people have chosen to come attend our meetings to see what's going on, whether they be at a committee or a regular meeting. And so I want to express my thanks for helping create a more welcome environment. With that, there's been some really cool wins, not only in committee, but in council. I think each of us have been able to talk more specifically about ways residents can get involved, whether that's being more thoughtful around what to notice, since we know there's an audience watching, or even just making sure we direct residents to get here, to be able to raise topics that are important to them. And then, of course, the entire quality of life project that unfolded this past year, these past couple of years, really, being able to have a very direct link to council, to be able to provide, hey, here's the committees. If there's something residents want to lead on that requires policy change, here's who you talk to. I'm not sure that effort, that intention had ever been so clear. And so, again, just really want to thank you all for holding space to talk about these different things, to really start to imagine something new, because I think that's what's needed moving forward. I'd be curious if anybody else has any final reflections on our goals for the committee, and or any statements you want to make about work you'd like to do moving forward. Mr. Bonsall.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. So I think it would be really important to just remember and recognize when we're talking about the CRA negotiating committee, but where that even came from, because for years the city had been doing CRA, basically had been not completely following everything that had to get done when it comes to CRAs, specifically when it comes to these annual CRA committee that has to get formed to review the CRAs. And normally HCDC does a lot of facilitation of that, but Norwood has never really participated in that. And so Ms. Stevenson kind of brought that to the attention, I guess a little bit over a year ago, when we had Mr. DeLuca come to the committee meeting, and we all had talked about it. And there were some fundamental issues, and I think I'm hoping that some of those are getting addressed. And I'm hoping that the next administration gets those addressed, just to make sure that we're all in compliance. But there was a lot of detail to that. There was a lot of research that the chair had to do. And, I just want to express my gratitude to you on that, because potentially some of that stuff wouldn't have gotten uncovered if you hadn't been persistent and hadn't kept pushing and pushing to make sure that did get uncovered.
Thank you. Any other final thoughts? We're not going to meet again this year. Yeah, Mr. Bonsall.
Yeah, thank you so much. So I also, you mentioned the welcome bags, and I think it's, I'm very appreciative of all of the community members that have worked, whether it be the people in the quality of life or the Chamber of Commerce or what have you, that had come to help make those welcome bags, a reality.
There's also some private funding. We think in the past I mentioned the Season Good Foundation supported some of those efforts too.
That's excellent. So, I wish it would be nice if those were, maybe there's somebody at the city that could help, just facilitate that, to keep that going. I mean, it never really was a huge priority, I don't think, of the current city administration. So it was great that the volunteers in those groups helped step up to make that a reality. I think there's an opportunity to grow that, but that's appreciative. I also want to reflect, so I remember that we had Terex come in for Harris Avenue, and I do hope the next committee, whoever they might be, I hope they keep on to, like keep encouraging developers to come and talk about some of their future plans. So the same way that PLK had came to council to talk about their plans for the playing card company, even though they were seeking something specific, but it was refreshing to kind of have that happen. And so I think I would really encourage the next committee to do that, to find ways that we can, make the public aware of what wants to be done at some of these different sites, so that there can be input ahead of just a final development plan coming to council, in composition with a development agreement or a CRA agreement. And that's the first time anybody hears about it. So it was just, like I said, refreshing to have that happen. So I appreciate the chair's support of that.
Mr. Thompson.
Yeah, just to add, I think it's a testament to I've known you since before, or since we started running together,
Yeah.
and know how important that community engagement has always been to what you were doing on council, and it showed with what this committee did. Just the fact that you were always pushing and reaching out to community and looking for ways to bring them into the process, and you deserve to be commended for that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to build on what Mr. Bonsall said about finding ways to continue to learn what development is happening. Some things we may have touched on just for a moment, but I think would be worthwhile to consider in future discussions. Is there a way to gain notice of any applications that go to the building department? One of the recommendations HCDC brought forward concerning opportunity zones was maybe changing the CRA application so that there's a box that gets checked that says, yep, we're using opportunity fund zone funding. Otherwise, that wouldn't be disclosed. Similarly, maybe when certain types of permits are pulled, you're given notice of who's pulling them, as well as public hearings. I attended a public hearing yesterday, and there were a number of residents who did as well, but I don't think that most council members are made aware. And so that might be something you think about. What are some other mechanisms to put in place so it's not always a singular driver trying to get that intel, but really building more rapport with the administration, particularly the building department, so that that information can flow to economic development more freely. Any other thoughts? Well, again, thank you all. This has been quite a joy. I'm really glad you could all attend this meeting in particular. I'm really glad for this discussion. I think it's going to serve you all in the city really well. And so, for the last time this year, we're going to adjourn this meeting. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.